Vegan and learning about animal rights, I started to think about animal ethics more broadly, which led me into learning about the lives of wild animals. And it turns out that the lives of most wild animals are filled with pain and misery too. They have to deal with starvation, disease, predation, sexual oppression.
He didn't know this. He had to study.
Through studying videos on YouTube, through studying not Richard Dawkins, what's his name? David Attenborough videos. Through studying them, I realized.
It seems like a very difficult life. The lives of animals in the wild also tend to be extremely short. Infant mortality is the norm. Most of the animals born within the last year are now already dead.
So here's what happens when a vegan starts to almost see reality and then has to find a way to hide that reality right behind the vegan smokescreen yet again, right? Wild animal suffering becomes a problem. We talked about this before. Remember we talked about David?
Yeah, it's always brought up, and it's like he didn't know this. He studied and found this out.
Well, David Pierce, remember we talked about David Pierce, who started Humanity Plus, the World Transhumanist Association. He's an ethical vegan, and he wrote that book called The Hedonistic Imperative. And he's all about maximizing well-being and reducing suffering, not just of human beings, but of all animals. So David Pierce actually suggests reprogramming, and in this transhumanist Gnostic way, rearranging the entire reality of all animals and of all life and of all of nature in order to reflect, I guess, the new, I guess it's this Gnostic concept of rearranging the world and of death and suffering to stop it. So basically, David Pierce wants to upload all the animals into Google Drive so that he can end suffering and they can all live in a virtual transhumanist reality. This is no joke. These people actually write about this crap. About ending all animal suffering through, vaccinating and microchipping them all and tracking them and giving them a perfectly curated false environment. It's this, I don't know, it's crazy. It's like this psychotic drive to create false prisons for all of creation in this weird Gnostic quest to free ourselves from the yoke of evil nature.
Well, this is the delusion you get if you don't have God. You end up with all of these absurd, meaningless, random worldviews that are given to you by billionaires who want to make sure you're dead. So you're just fodder for Satan.
There you go. So wild animals, we got to stop wild animal suffering. How are you going to do that, buddy?
Not only are these individuals suffering, but the scale of this suffering is incredibly large.
Okay, so suffering.
Notice the naturalist fallacy here. There's a reason why this is one of the fallacies, because for a long time we've heard that it's just natural, right? It's unnatural to do this. It's natural to do that. There's no a priori notion of what is or is not natural without a paradigm or a worldview to explain what that is and what that means. But all these people just act like it just is. It's obvious what's natural or whatever. And then they realize as they get deeper and deeper into this stuff, like this lesbian ant here, he's realized that, yes, you have to give a sense and a context to what it means to be natural or unnatural and what suffering does or doesn't mean. Now, what is the purpose? Maybe suffering has a purpose.
Yeah. So they assume that suffering is bad. So this is always an important question. What is suffering? Right? What is suffering? Please define suffering. And if they're coming from a naturalist standpoint, how do you measure this? He's talking about studying the science. We're studying the suffering. How do you study the suffering? Right? How do you study it? You have to, tell us. How do you quantify the suffering? And they can't, I haven't heard a legitimate answer yet. A lot of them talk about, well-being. Well, okay, if you just pump something full of dopamine and you just, get all the animals wasted off of opioids, then that's going to end their suffering. What if you just dose the whole planet, dose everything with a massive OD of heroin, and they'll end their suffering. It'll be blissful and beautiful, but they'll all die, and their suffering will be over. Some of these people are literally there. The anti-natalist threat of veganism and how veganism and anti-natalism are very, very close. Right?
One way we could eliminate all suffering to eliminate all beings.
Exactly, and that's antinatalism. So they say suffering is life, then we have to eliminate all suffering, and that's eliminate all life.
And wrap our heads around this, let's get warmed up with some smaller numbers. There are currently around 7.8 billion humans on planet Earth.
Ew.
To give us perspective, let's put this on a number line where 7.8 billion is equal to 1 inch, or about the width of a quarter. If you stacked up the entire human population on this number line, you would get a line about 1 inch long. Now let's look at the number of animals living...
Go ahead, Jay, say it. No, I'm just kidding.
...in factory farms right now, who are being...
say the joke, Jay. Do the joke so I don't have to do it.
...systematically tortured for meat, dairy, and eggs. This is around 114 billion. On the number line, that's about 14 inches, or the width of a laptop. 114 billion is in the same ballpark as the total number of humans who have ever lived. Now let's talk about the number of wild vertebrates. Vertebrates are animals with a backbone. This includes mammals, reptiles, birds, amphibians, and fish. There are around 10 trillion vertebrates, which on our number line would equate to about 100 feet long, or about as long as a basketball court.
This is great moral calculus. This is some hardcore science. We need some beakers, and we need like a Bill Nye gif up in the upper right hand corner here.
I want to see some bubbling green liquids, or I don't believe this is.
Yeah, I need a beaker with the bubbling green liquid. And like those little Instagram gifs of Bill Nye with like science.
Yeah, and a lab coat.
Yes.
Lab coat.
Yes. So continue, please. Quantifying all life. The official census of all wild vertebrates is 10 to the 13th power, 10 trillion. Yeah.
Okay, let's stop there for a second. Imagine standing on one side of a basketball court, looking up at the net above you, and trying to spot on the far end of the basketball court a quarter that's been placed on the floor. That quarter represents the entire number of individual human lives being lived right now. And everything in between you and that quarter represents the number of individual vertebrates living in the wild who we know are aware of their lives. The number of sentient individuals living in the wild is mind-boggling. If we then add wildland arthropods, which includes insects like spiders, this adds a further 100,000 trillion animals. And at this point, it's certainly...
100,000 trillion. 100,000 trillion.
So there's a bunch of bugs and animals. Okay, so what?
Yeah. Well, they're suffering, Jay. We need to stop their suffering. We have to save them all.
Oh, is he going to do the moral calculus of like the points, suffering points, and how many?
If we can reduce their suffering by 3%, if one white savior called Humane Hancock can reduce their suffering by 1% and educate all the savages to stop eating meat, then we can reduce animal suffering by 10 to the 17th power, which is 100 trillion times.
Impossible to truly appreciate the number of animals living in the wild. Our brains just aren't capable of comprehending these numbers. On the number line, the number of wildland arthropods takes us from London to Snowdonia. Having learned about the scale and intensity of suffering in the wild, and understanding that we have the potential to do something about it, it became obvious to me that this is one of the most important issues on the planet. And with that said, let's get on with it.
So, like, everyone's locked in their homes. You're told you have to wear a mask. We're going to completely restructure every single thing about your life. Hey, we got mandatory vaccinations. Healthy, happy medicine shots that are totally safe. There are... Okay, so you got all this happening. You got child slaves slaving away, dying for your cobalt, for your methylcobalamin supplements. You've got color revolution, coup d'etats, orchestrated by big money interests all over the world, enslaving people to extract their resources, both physical and labor resources. But the biggest problem in the world is some of these invertebrates are suffering, right? Crickets don't have access to iPads, right? Cows don't have the right to vote. This is so terrible. Black widows are killing and eating smaller bugs.
Video.
Hunters will kill the strongest animals they can find, the most impressive animals, the animals with the biggest antlers, the strongest animals. But that's not what happens in the wild. Normally, predators will kill the weak and the sick animals. And so actually what Joe's doing is something really dangerous that's having a knock-on effect to the ecology and to the evolution of species. For example, bighorn sheep have seen...
So you're ruining evolution. You're harming evolution by hunting them. That's the argument.
In the size of their horns decrease in the past 30 years. And there are now fewer Asian and African elephants that have tusks. But how does that make sense? Because these attributes are normally signifiers of a species that is being prosperous. Because these attributes would normally be beneficial for those animals. However, in the modern world, these attributes are seen as being detrimental to these animals because it makes them more likely and susceptible to be killed by human hunters. And so actually by hunting these animals, Joe and people like him are doing the opposite of what should be happening in nature.
So he knows what should be happening in nature. Him as a creature, he believes that he's this creature, this automaton created by nature, growing from a germplasm and pond
Here
scum.
comes his ought. This should.
Yeah.
Here's your
You
ought.
should.
The imperative.
So if this young lady came to you with this argument, Jay, what would be your response? Would you have a question? Would you have what would be your response to this young woman?
Why should I do anything given your worldview?
Yeah. What do you think his answer would likely be?
Something circular about how we ought to reduce suffering. We ought to ensure the well-being of other entities. But why?
Yeah,
I didn't ask
don't
why
you feel
wanted.
it's
I
wrong?
asked for a justification for why. On what basis?
And the appeal to emotion, right? No, don't
Yeah,
you just feel?
exactly.
You just
appeal
feel
to
that it's
emotion,
wrong.
appeal to various other fallacies.
You just feel it. Don't you feel that it's wrong? Would you want to slash a dog's throat?
Would
Say
you
stuff
want
like
that happening to you?
Would you want to be
but
eaten?
I'm not an animal.
Yeah.
So here we're entering into the domain of metaphysics and the whole worldview. So I don't have the worldview of Joey Cardstrong or Earthling Ed or whoever this character is. They're all the same to me.
Yeah, Gelfling Ed. Right. No, and this is the
Gelfling Ed.
I think that's the official. Yeah, Gelfling Ed. No, Earthling Ed. Excuse me. Sorry, Ed. Edward Gaunt.
He looks like a Gelfling.
Does, right? You're like the only person who gets that reference. Nobody laughs at that ever. I always say Gelfling Ed. Thank you, Jay Dyer. You just redeemed
great.
yourself by laughing at my stupid Gelfling joke. Nobody
No, I
gets
like
it,
that.
man.
That was perfect.
Shout out to Jim Henson and the Gelflings. What was the head Gelfling's name? It wasn't Link. Link he's basically like a gayer Link.
There's one of them is named Jen. I don't remember if that's the guy or the girl.
Are you talking about Black Crystal?
Yeah, the Dark Crystal. The Black Crystal. Come on. Such a civilian.
Oh, that's the other version. You've been watching the other version.
That's the OnlyFans version.
creating a transgression in the development of animals rather than a progression.
Ed is explicitly stating that what happens naturally in the wild is also what should be happening in the wild. But how are we coming to this conclusion? Well, we could say it should be this way because this is the way it is without human interference. It is simply the way of nature. Of course.
Okay, so Jay, do you see this weird contradiction? So nature and humanity, we're separate from nature. I mean, how do we reconcile this? Why is man separate from nature? Isn't it funny? All these vegans, they seem to assume the fall. Right? Human beings are separate from nature. They seem to assume this. The nature is doing things that are wrong. Right? Animals are killing and eating each other. They have this sense that they don't like what they see. But it's funny how they just.
Yeah, this is again the destruction of all this is just to read David Hume because he's a more consistent atheist. And if you just think about the way that they usually try to explain why they think you should do this or why they think that this is supposed to be the case, is what we need to shoot for. You ask them why, and they usually say, because we know that's what we need to do, because I feel like that's right, because we've evolved to have reasoning and empathy. None of those are statements of what they think are just statements of fact. Okay, you don't get from a statement of fact or what is the case to what ought to be the case. And anybody who's read David Hume knows that if you're an atheist, if you're a skeptic, you don't believe in God, metaphysics, etc., there's no way to justify the belief that you can jump from a is the case to an ought to be the case. So the whole of veganism is destroyed just by that alone, because they don't have a basis to tell you that you ought to be vegan, that you should do this, that you shouldn't do that.
There you go.
And
as vegan
anytime they
activists.
reply with something like, well, yeah, but wouldn't you want that for you? That's not a justification.
Yeah. Yeah. Your desires are not justification. Your feelings are not justification.
I want there to be pink Bill Cosbys that I can fly around in the sky.
That doesn't
exist. Is that a
exist.
justification for the pink Bill Cosby that I can ride around and fly in the sky? No. But I really want there to be that.
Disney World, take note.
I want to see that.
That's the new Disney ride. Take the red pill or the blue pill. Bill Cosby. Bill Cosby as Morpheus ride at Disney World, 2029.
So what they don't know is like,
Spend a
so
lot
if you take classes in epistemology or philosophy, the easy first things you learn is about justifying a belief, giving account for your belief, distinguishing it from what are typically erroneous courses of reasoning, right? Just saying, I think it should be that way. I feel like it should be that way. Those are not arguments. They're not justifications. They're not sound reasons. You have to give a sound reason. You can't just say, it is that way.
It is what it is, man. It is what it is. I mean, it is what it is basically do what thou will.
So people in the chat, we already let perspective philosophy into my Discord and it didn't go well. I'm not wasting my time with these people. These people are idiots. They're atheists. They don't have any belief in anything beyond.
Wait, Jay, I've heard you here. I've heard you debate a lot of atheists very effectively. I've heard you debate many atheists really, really well, right? So I don't know. What do you mean? Like they're atheists? They don't bring anything good? Because I've heard some great debates with you and atheists.
Because by necessity, I already debated him in the Discord. I've seen what I'm going to get. I'm not interested in the same old atheist story. I've had hundreds of atheist debates in 20 years. I've been debating for 20 years. I'm not new to this. There's no new atheist argument any atheist is going to present to me that I haven't heard for the last 20 years. So no, I don't have to debate somebody and prove myself to some guy with 2,000 followers that I'm scared of that random ass dude, as if I haven't heard every freaking atheist argument for the last 20 years. I already know. I could argue atheism better than them. I could go to David Hume and critique my own position better than they could. Because Hume is the best atheist. He's the quintessential atheist. He's the atheist that we, as presuppositionalists, tell everyone else to read. Because he shows you that consistent atheism and skepticism from David Hume all the way up until today with Quine, right, just shows you that there's no such thing as logic and justification. For Quine, it's just psychology. Quine says we don't do justification anymore. We don't prove our positions anymore. It doesn't exist because there's no way to do it, right? Because he's following in hundreds of years of atheist logic and argumentation. There's hundreds of years of this conversation that's gone on already. And most of these people don't even know this. They don't even know what the centuries of conversation and debate are. And they want to come as if there's not already some guy that's made your dumb argument. Probably 20 years ago, probably 50 years ago. Probably
Hold on, Jay. But look, dude, here, I've got the best argument right here. God's mean, though. I don't like God. God's mean. I don't like the things that God does. Well, how come God doesn't make everything like I want it? Then it always eventually comes to that, right? Oh, well, how come God made it to where I have to die? How come God made it to where I'm not perfect and I'm not God? And it's like, that's like their argument. How come I'm not God, though?
So I just want them to be consistent. And what would be more consistent for them is to be like Quine and say that there is no such thing as logic and debate anymore. There's just doing human psychology. That's it. And probably some of these people, deep down, that if they're consistent with their atheism, that's what they think. Because it's time to give up logic. It's time to give up regularity in nature. It's time to give up induction. All of these things that Hume said you can't really explain or justify because you're all dumb empiricists. Empiricism can't justify any of those things because they go beyond empirical sense data. Right? I mean, I can make it really easy. Almost all of those guys are empiricists. Almost all of them. They believe that knowledge comes from sense data, right? But you can't prove from sense data that all knowledge comes from sense data. That alone refutes that whole worldview, right? Again, go read David Hume. So I don't even have to, I can just say, just read David Hume. You don't even have to debate me. Where is your response to your own atheist, David Hume?
So for and what is Hume's argument? What is the most important argument that Hume makes? What is the most important point that Hume makes that drives the point home that you're driving right now?
That any belief that we have cannot consistently be justified when you are an empiricist, because sense data is limited, extremely limited. But most of the atheist tradition, there's a few outliers, but most of the atheist tradition has tended to be based around empirical sense data arguments. And that's just simply to say that anything that's not immediately under the microscope within your purview, you can't justify or know or have a reason, an account, an explication for why you believe that. Logic, right? The past, the self, the mind, induction, regularity in nature, like all of these things that go into what it is to be science, the presuppositions of science. So none of those things can really be explained or given an account for or grounded other than to just say that they are. But just saying that they are or just appealing to sense data, you can't say, well, I know that my senses are reliable because my senses tell me that. That's circular, you see. You can't do that. That's an invalid move. It's not a good argument. So basically, all of that whole crew of people has never consistently answered David Hume because they can't, because when you have that presupposition, there's nowhere else to go. It's a self-limiting position, you see. Does that make sense?
What do you think, chat? Anybody in the chat?
So I'm saying it's very, very simple. All knowledge comes through sense data. The proposition, all knowledge comes through sense data, cannot be known from sense data. So it's self-refuting. And then all the other arguments that Hume's making are just variations of that. Where in sense data do you find the self? Where in sense data do you find the past?
This is what's so weird about debating some of these people, right? So they'll start out with this ethical argument. Then they'll move over to, you have to prove everything using empiricism.
I'm pointing out the appeal to nature fallacies. That
you're going to have to prove everything using sense data, using sensory data and empiricism. But then they can't prove that very statement themselves empirically. All right, so it's self-contradictory right away. You have to prove everything empirically. All knowledge comes through empiricism, through sense data.
Right.
Does that knowledge itself come through sense data?
And no, obviously it does not. So you're correct that the whole position falls apart right there, because that's a starting point. And by the way, that's not the only serious problem for a atheist, empiricist, skeptic kind of person. There's also the myth of the given, the problem of the external world, the problem of induction, the status of immaterial objects, and the fact that there's no properly basic belief that you can show to actually be properly basic. So these are all very serious, completely destructive problems for that kind of worldview.
All right, let's keep going with young Austin Powers here.
non-vegans make when attempting to justify their consumption of animal products. And so it would be almost ironic to make this argument. For those of you who don't know, an appeal to nature is a logical fallacy that occurs when something is claimed to be good because it's perceived as natural, or bad because it's perceived as unnatural. However, there are many naturally occurring things that we consider to be bad, just as there are many unnatural things that we think are good. For example, many diseases occur naturally, and yet as a society, we agree that disease is bad.
Again, what is natural? How do you define this naturally? It seems like their definition of natural is without human intervention. As soon as humanity intervenes, it becomes unnatural. And this is an assumption that you see in a lot of worldviews. Where does this come from, Jay?
Well, this is to commit the word concept fallacy, or to be, you could frame it like it's a loaded question, because that's a really nuanced, difficult term. It's not exactly clear what, quote, nature is outside of some context or paradigm. So, for example, other words in the history of philosophy like being, existence, nature, reason, these are very common words, but they have very different senses in a lot of different philosophers' systems. So one of the reasons that there's the naturalist fallacy, which he's correct to point out, I'm glad he at least got that right, is because it's not exactly clear what is.
You got to turn off the video on your end.
Sorry, somebody sent me this link. Sorry, Jay, keep going. Naturalistic fallacy. Sorry.
It's just that it's not sufficiently clear a priori what is or isn't natural without a context or paradigm that goes along with that. Again, the example we always give is, predator prey. Is that natural or unnatural?
Right.
And there's a lot of things that occur in, quote, nature, but that doesn't on the surface tell us whether that is natural or unnatural. So,
right. Well, so
actually, this guy is kind of correct here in this point.
Yeah, so this is why I found this video so interesting, because he broaches the truth, but then it's fascinating to see how he judo moves it back into we must justify, we got to justify the veganism.
Bad, and we want people who are suffering from disease to receive treatment so they can live as healthy and as happy a life as possible.
So again, what is happy? What is happy? There are people who take pleasure in harming people, right? They're masochists. There are people who take pleasure in sin, in destruction, in chaos, and that makes them happy.
So the mistake of these guys is the mistake of a lot of people, which is, again, just like with the naturalist fallacy, there's no a priori clear brute fact just by osmosis looking at the word happy that tells you what that actually is. Okay, so natural, happy, reason, logic, all of these things are part of a paradigm, and they only make sense within a complete totality worldview, right? There's no, let me give you an example to prove this. We've proven this in the past. Like if I'm talking to a guy who's an atheist, and he believes that the things out there in the world just are, they don't have a beginning, they weren't created, they're just matter in motion. So he believes that an object exists, right, just as that, without any inherent meaning, it just is. As a Christian, I believe that things exist as creations, right? So just the word existence is not synonymous between our two worldviews. My notion of what something existing is radically different from his notion of something existence. So you can't appeal to things like existence, nature, reason, as if there's a common notion amongst all systems as to what those things are.
When they start appealing, they say, oh, well, reason tells me that this, or logic tells me that this. Right? These are metaphysical concepts. Reason.
That's true. And yes, it's true that we all have a faculty of reason, but that's different than explaining or justifying what that faculty of reason is according to a paradigm. So the fact that I'm using reasoning is not itself a justification or an explanation of reasoning. So that's another mistake they'll do. They'll be like, well, we're all using reason, so therefore we all know what reason is. No, I mean, a guy who uses an iPhone who's a computer technician knows what an iPhone is all about. And a guy who's, living in some homeless dude who doesn't have any education, he can use an iPhone, but he doesn't know the workings of an iPhone. So the mere fact that we do something or use something says nothing about the knowledge or justification of that thing.
I'm not homeless. I live in a mud hut, and I do have a bachelor's degree, just so you know, Jay. And that was hate speech.
The point that in nature, the weak animals are usually the ones who are killed, whereas hunters kill the healthiest and most impressive animals, causing a transgression in the development of animals rather than a progression. However, I think there's something we're forgetting here. Natural selection by evolution will select for traits in individuals that increase the probability of reproductive success. Natural selection does not select for happiness or well-being. As long as a heritable trait increases reproductive success, it's likely to quickly become prevalent in a given population, even if it also has some negative effects for the well-being of individuals. For example, male cats have evolved to have little spikes on their penises. During intercourse, as the penis is withdrawn, the spikes will...
I don't know why my wife laughed at that, but
all the examples
they have little spikes on their penises. Jessica says, out of all the examples you could have come up with, and Jessica, look, he put a picture up.
He's so thoughtful.
All these weirdos, man, they're into the weirdest stuff, all these creeps.
They have spiky penises. You can find them on OnlyFans.
Break the walls of the feline vagina. This sounds like a very pleasant experience, but it increases the chances of reproductive success in male cats. My point is that natural selection...
It's so funny. You could take this. Oh well, clearly Dyer. He has this shirt which looks quite like a boomer shirt. And when you think about it, the more mature a woman is, the more fertile she is. So if you can attract a mate with a boomer shirt like Dyer or Tristan are currently wearing, you can increase your chances of passing on your genes because the boomers will accept your flannel shirt genetics. Therefore, the flannel shirt is improving your ability to pass on your genes to future generations. And there's a battle between the Hawaiian shirts and the flannel shirts to see which can truly pass on the best genes, which will survive and be the survival of the fittest. And we can tell that it is the fittest because it survives.
Letting you know that it's not a Hawaiian boomer shirt.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. That's like a Stussy. That's
It kind of is. It looks like a 90s, like a Massimo or...
Yeah.
Is that the French, what do you call the Saints? What, I don't know.
That's a cool shirt, man. I gotta say, I do have to say, you guys, we make fun of Jay's shirts sometimes, but I am an admirer of some of Jay's attire. So he's got some nice prints. That Dyer, he got some nice prints.
This was a gift, actually. I did not go and pay for this. This is a designer shirt.
His wife forced them to wear that shirt, is what he's saying. She made him wear it.
No, my mommy bought me a designer shirt.
Okay. Somebody, you vegans can clip that, and you can say you won the debate.
We won the debate. We got him to admit that his mommy bought him designer shirts.
About the well-being of individuals. And to me, a progression would refer to an improvement in the well-being of the individuals.
Okay, so how do you define well-being? How do you measure well-being? Right? There are people who derive well-being from destroying people's lives, like the royal family, Jimmy Savile. What about his well-being? Right? How did Jimmy Savile measure his well-being? Is that just as justified as how you measure your well-being? Like, how do we measure?
I mean, yeah, the right to mate and have the coitus with dead animal carcasses and dead human carcasses is a fundamental right that every pleasure-seeking being ought to have.
It's the fundamental right.
As opposed to a return to the naturally occurring state. Furthermore, if Joe Rogan decides to only hunt and kill the weak...
I don't know why that's funny.
Tristan, by the way, there's a vegan in the chat that would like you to know that, I don't know if you're aware of this, but you can actually get all of the necessary nutrients without having to kill another being.
You can get all the nutrients.
I don't know if you've heard this argument before.
Yeah, you can get all the nutrients you need. Hey, name the nutrient that you can get. Name the nutrient that you can't get from plants, you can get from animals that makes you healthy. They'll say that. Name the nutrient. Name the nutrient. Is that this reductionist? Oh, you can't reduce it to this level? Oh, it must be false. But it's like they're always having to deal with people feeling like shit on their vegan diet, feeling physically and mentally ill, leaving veganism, getting physically and mentally well. Well, how do you justify that? How do you justify creating suffering in human beings who you believe are just animals?
I do want to give the vegans credit, though. I'm being totally serious because they do serve a great function to call attention to the fact that
the fact. I have to. Go ahead.
Yes, that fact.
Yeah.
That fact. Yeah. Exactly. That fact. When they go out and debate people, they do call attention to the fact that you can't really talk about natural law and what's natural without metaphysics.
Yes.
And so they do serve a purpose to force people to admit that there has to be a distinction between humans and animals. That gets into the domain of metaphysics, the soul, reasoning, right, et cetera, being made in the image of God. That's the distinction that we have as to why there's higher dignity that humans have and the right that was given to them to eat animals by God. So in other words, if I wanted to make a point to other atheists or people who do believe that they have a right to eat animals, let's say you got an atheist who's a carnivore and then you got an atheist who's a vegan. These two can never get out of the dilemma. They're going to be chasing each other's tails. And so the vegans do serve an interesting purpose to point out to another atheist carnivore
on what basis is it wrong or right? And I'm not saying that the vegans are right. I'm saying that between these two, they can never resolve this debate.
Yeah, and they bring up the
question is
nonsensical
ultimately
nature of our modern
metaphysical.
worldview, right? They bring up and they point to, and they're very good at manipulating the average normie. This is why I find them the perfect example, because they even like, ask yourself, right? Ask yourself's argument will work on the average pharmaceutical drug suckling normie, right? The brain clogged normie will buy into that argument, and they already feel guilty and ashamed, and they've been institutionally. There's this whole institution of making people feel guilty and ashamed for just being human, right? Like your exhalations are bad, your CO2 is bad. Every time you step on the ground, we're back. I'm back here with Jay Dyer.